good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Welcome to our second webinar, which is Seafood Sustainability and Insights with GoodFish. So welcome. Natalie, I'll hand over to you for a sec.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again this week. It's great to have you, and it's amazing to have GoodFish with us as well. So last week, we really looked at the broader food system and all the impacts we have on a broad scheme of things. Now, this week and the following weeks of our series, we're going to start really nutting into what best practice is and how to identify best practice in our industry. When we always talk about our industry and best practice, what comes up the most is sustainable procurement. So today we're going to start talking about what is sustainable procurement and what resources we have available to us for menu planning and so forth, which is so important. And I just want to encourage everybody, please use the chat box. Please share with us really interesting things that you may be doing in your restaurant, resources that you may have. Please use the chat box as a point of community throughout this webinar as well. So today, obviously, we are in our second workshop for sustainable seafood, and then next week we go into week 3, which is food waste and controlling the value of our bin. Before we hand over to Steph, I just wanted to have a chat about, I wanted to open this session, I guess, and Karen as well. We wanted to really talk about menu planning and sustainable procurement. And not only that, but the position that chefs have and the power we have to advocate for what we're cooking and how we're cooking it. As chefs, we've always had an amazing influence over the way we design our innovation and our cooking and also the trends that we are able to set.
And I suppose that's when you look at it in menu planning, that's where you look at, it's that whole thing, isn't it? It's about your procurement, about our supply chain management, our best practices, and understanding really what we're buying and where it's sourced from, and the food miles, etc., that comes with it.
That's right, Karen. And I think this word sustainable, just to jump in there with what you were saying, this what we're talking about there with sustainable procurement, there's 2 ways that we can really look at it. It can either be the size of our food chain, or the food miles, being a shorter supply chain, or it can be best practice. And best practice comes from the best practice in the way that we're farming, we're fishing, or we're sourcing, like the practices of our suppliers and our representatives in the food chain.
Exactly. And you look at what we use and the protein that goes on there, and hence the reason today why we've got GoodFish here. It's also to give us that knowledge about what we're buying. Seafood is a highly consumed product. You just look at the markets at Christmas time here in Sydney. That's where I'm based. It's absolutely packed out at Christmas time, getting prawns, etc. So seafood, it's a very complex world, and how we fish and overfishing, etc., where that all comes from too. So that's a good link in today. And I suppose that's where GoodFish comes in with Stephanie also.
Definitely. So actually 1/3 of our fish globally is either overfished or fished right up to their limits. So the hospitality industry, we have a huge role to play in this. I just wanted to add one thing before we keep going. When we're talking about creating sustainable practices in our operation, the most common thing that we get stuck on is probably the time. You know, menu planning is one of those things you start to love to hate after a while. You know, you got to design the menu, you got to design the recipes. Now we got to think about what's a sustainable procurement option for me as well. The biggest advice as we start to step into this world and start to make a change as an industry, I've been given, and that I feel it works, is just choose your 2 most consumed items in the operation. Don't try and do the whole menu at once, but the 2 most consumed items. And then, like Karen said, moving into Christmas, we're going to see seafood everywhere. Seafood is really prominent on our menus. So as we're choosing those 2 top for consume items and choosing what our best practice in procurement is, there's incredible resources available to us to cut our time down. And that is 100% GoodFish. So I'll let Karen introduce Stephanie, and then we can take it from there.
It's going to be a very brief introduction, Stephanie. So I actually haven't met Stephanie before this, so I'd be quite curious. I might hand over to you, Stephanie, to do a quick introduction, but it's Stephanie McGee from GoodFish. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for having me. I love seafood. I love talking about GoodFish.
Stephanie, you might need to speak up a little bit. We actually can't hear you at this point. Sorry to step in.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? I'll move it closer to me.
A little.
Let me try this.
Yeah, the headsets are always the winner. So while Stephanie is organizing her microphone, how we come across GoodFish as the table food consultants is we were consulting for a sustainable seafood menu. And we had to look for the resources that were available to us and had to look for a brand or a resource that we could really trust. What we see in the seafood market right now, and one of the challenges, last week we talked a lot about challenges. One of the challenges in the industry currently is being able to understand our labeling, able to understand the practice of both fisheries and aquaculture, which Stephanie is going to jump into a little bit later on, and really deciding what is the best practice for my restaurant, what is the best practice for our procurement. And having these resources available where we can just jump in and have a look is an incredible, not only for our education, but also for our time management. So GoodFish is an amazing tool, and I will hand over to Stephanie back for round 2. Second time lucky.
Let's see if this works. Is that better? I'm going to have to speak to my IT guys about this this microphone issue. Okay, I'm going to try and take control of this screen. Let's see if that works. But yeah, so I'm the GoodFish Program Manager. GoodFish has been around since 2004. And it was created in 2004 by AMCS, which is the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And that's essentially because there became more awareness that the oceans weren't actually this infinite resource. And that some ways of fishing and farming had higher impacts on the environment than others. So there became this growing consumer demand for a tool that would just cut out all the confusion and help make buying sustainable seafood easier. I'm trying to show my slide, but I'm not getting control. So we'll just have to, I'll just talk if that's okay. Sorry, everyone, I've got a nice little presentation for you, but that's okay. So essentially the whole thing with GoodFish is that we use a simple traffic light system of green, go ahead, amber, eat less, and red, say no, avoid. And we take a really holistic approach to the environmental impact of the fisheries and the farms. And we're fully independent of industry and government, and that means that we can provide an objective view of the fisheries and farms that we assess. It's really important to know that we're not a certification body or a certification scheme. We're a consumer awareness tool. And that means we show a snapshot in time of the environmental sustainability of a fishery or farm at that specific time. So if something big changes, like maybe there's a stock collapse of a certain species of fish because of overfishing, we'll then look at updating our assessment, but otherwise we look to update our assessment every 3 years. And we've got more than 240 assessments covering more than 93% of what's available on the Australian market. And that's not just, that's not just local, that's also imported seafood. And, Australians consume about, in 2021, 2022, Australians consumed more than 350,000 tons of seafood. More than 350,000 tons of seafood in that year. And that's about 14 kilograms per person. But only 35% of that actually came from local sources. So, 65% is still imported. And we're not saying don't eat imported seafood. There's a lack in supply and we need to cater to that. But our guide encompasses as much as we can. So 93% of what is available on the market. I really wish I could show you my slides. Sorry.
Stephanie, what maybe you could try that again, but try the slides again. But as we're trying to try the slides again, I wanted to really ask if we could start to jump into as well. What is the difference between? So we talk about our seafood consumption a lot, right? We're talking about 93. The percentage of Australians in the seafood consumption. Can we talk about where we're getting our seafood from? So I know there's two types of, there's two areas of seafood, two areas that we get our seafood from fisheries and from aquaculture. Can you just talk quickly on what is the two differences of that and how GoodFish works to assess that? And I feel like I've got the slides.
You do. So okay. So and this is such an important question, and it's a question we get asked quite frequently. What's better, farmed or wild caught fish? And sadly, it's not an easy answer. We can't blanket sustainability like that because there are both fisheries and farms that have a light touch on our oceans. But there are also fisheries and farms in Australia that are, or not just in Australia, but that are having a detrimental impact on the environment. Australia definitely has some incredible seafood, and we're maybe handling management slightly better than some of the other countries, but we still have a way to go. And I'd like to give you two examples. Of pretty prominent species that are farmed in Australia. One pretty impactful, it's on our red list, and then one that's actually done a pretty good job of mitigating any environmental impact, and that's on our green list. So the first example is Tasmanian salmon, and there have been huge environmental impacts as a result of the industry, some potentially irreversible. And in the other industry is the Australian farmed barramundi industry. And it's made up of many different companies, and it's taken each of these companies have taken different measures to ensure they mitigate any impact on the environment. And I can show you how just one of those companies is doing that. So if we could go just as the next. Oh, do you want me to?
Yeah, so Steph, can we just, so I don't mean to interrupt you there, but that's incredible. So we've got these two really great sources of seafood that can have pros and cons in each. Now, let's take out the complexity of that and why GoodFish is here. And can you tell us a little bit about your rating and exactly how it works? That would be amazing.
Yeah, sure. So if you want to go to the next one, I can just give you an overview of GoodFish, and then we can talk about how we actually come up with these assessments. Okay, Yeah. Okay. So our guide is really easy to search. We've got that green, amber, and red traffic light system. We've got our website, so goodfish.org.au, and then we've also got our app, which is available with that QR code. It's also available on our website. You can scan. You can search via rating. So whether it's better choice, eat less, or say no. You can search by location. Is it New South Wales? Is it imported? Is it Commonwealth fishery? How is it caught? And even how can you cook it? But because we've got 240 assessments on our guide, sometimes scrolling through the list of them can take a while. So you can also just, as the video showed, you can also just type in the seafood that you're actually looking for, and it'll bring up the information. If it's on the guide, it'll bring up whether it's green, amber, or red, and give you a little bit more information as to why that is the case. Yeah. So just something important to remember is, when you are choosing green or amber seafood and you're not choosing red listed seafood, you're supporting those fisheries and farms that are working really hard to ensure that they have a light touch on the oceans. And when you avoid seafood on the red list, it really does reduce the market power of those fishing or producing it and incentivizes them to improve. So it's a really important step for people to take.
So the
we've
way
also got, yeah.
Sorry, the way that we're purchasing is not even only influencing our consumers, but it's also influencing the practices that we expect from the industry. Is that a summary of what you're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. By creating that market demand and market power, you're actually putting the money back into the hands of the fishers that are doing the right thing. But if you're taking it out of the hands of the people who are doing the wrong thing and they see who is getting that support, then you shift demand towards sustainable fishers and support them, and the other guys have to change their practices.
Yeah, that's incredible. So we were talking a little bit about why how GoodFish makes their assessment, okay? And GoodFish makes their assessment. So you're saying that GoodFish creates an assessment holistically. I believe that's what you're saying to me on the phone the other day. Can you tell me a little bit more about that holistic approach and the difference when you assess aquaculture to fisheries?
Yes, sure. So if we go 2 slides down, okay, so we've got, there's a lot of complex information out there, but we don't need you to do the complex research. That's what we've done. So we've got our scientific experts. You'll have to go 1 slide down or 2 slides down from that. So when I say we look holistically, what it means is we're not just looking at one factor. We're not just looking at whether the population health is okay. We're looking at a whole bunch of other factors to make sure that the fishery as a whole doesn't impact the environment, or the aquaculture industry as a whole doesn't impact the environment. So when and because fisheries and farms operate so differently from each other, we have to assess them differently. So we've got 2 different methodologies that we use. The first one is for fisheries, and we look at 4 different factors, 4 key areas in that fishery. Are the targeted fish stocks okay? How is the population doing? Is it healthy? And is fishing impacting it in any way? Then we look at, are other species, whether they be endangered or otherwise, being negatively impacted by the fishing of whatever we are trying to fish? Then how is the habitat doing as a result of fishing? Are you fishing on sensitive coral mounds, or is the habitat not even impacted in any way as a result of what you're fishing or how you're fishing? And then something that is really important is there management in place, and is it effective? It's one thing to have management in place, but if it's not actually doing anything that would help mitigate anything, it doesn't really make a difference.
So
sorry, Natalie, you've broken up.
I don't know, something's happened
Well,
with the microphone there.
Sorry, when we talk about management and you use this word, is it the management of the best practices of the fisheries or of the aquaculture?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I only heard the second half of that.
When we talk about the management of fisheries and aquaculture, is it the practices we're referring to there?
Yes, so it's what they're catching, how much they are catching, you know, managing that, making sure that that level of catch doesn't impact any future efforts of the fishery or just health of the fishery. It makes sure that nothing else is being impacted negatively. Make sure they stay within a certain fishing area. So there are a number of different ways that management can and should play a role in just making sure that the fishery is managed well, I guess. Yeah.
So we got a pretty cool question in the chat box. So it says, how can restaurants better educate their customers of the importance of sustainable fish and sourcing and encourage them to choose more sustainable options? I'm assuming this is when they order, the consumer, and their impactful solutions. So would you be able to answer that in a way?
Oh, I mean, that's quite an extended thing, I guess. You know, chefs have such an important role in driving demand. So if you want to have sustainable seafood options on your menu, and only sustainable seafood options on your menu, and you know, that can really, and then consumers don't really have a choice. But I'm struggling to actually find out how to answer this properly. It's such a multi-layered question.
I suppose, Stephanie, jumping in on that, it's talking about the importance of sustainable seafood, how we source it in a restaurant. Is it something, I know with the new labeling guidelines coming in, etc., we're going to have to label, is it sustainable, where it's sourced from, etc. So I suppose it's talking about how do we make that cost effective? Because we know in Australia at the moment, what is it, about 80 to 85% of our seafood is exported, prepared overseas, and a lot is brought back in. So it's that whole idea of, you know, how do you give that value to a customer? If you're putting your prices up, is it because it's sustainable, it's Australia, it's not coming from overseas, etc.?
Yeah, look, in terms
and training
of
our staff on how to bring that out.
Well, I guess transparency is the best thing there, you know, so effective labeling, having not just, because the rules around labeling in restaurants is changing to whether it's Australian, whether it's imported, or whether it's mixed. But when it's imported and mixed, you don't necessarily need the detail of where it's actually coming from. Now, we're not trying to disincentivize, again, imported species. So when we're talking GoodFish talks about the sustainability of where it is, you know, when it is actually taken out of the water. What is the sustainability there? We can't speak to air miles and things like that. But in terms of having labeling, having efficient labeling, so you have what species is it, where is it from, and then you add, you know, how was it actually caught or farmed? Because each of those different things have implications for its sustainability. And having that transparent labeling puts the power in the consumer's hand that they can use something like the GoodFish Guide to be able to make a decision whether whether it's on the green, amber, or red list. I would be very cautious.
Go, sorry. I think today, I think today we really wanted to touch on labeling, and this is something that I've expressed to you, Steph, and many times we've had, you know, a little bit of frustration. You can see a sustainable label, but then we can see it's been transported and packed over many countries. So at that point, do we start choosing sustainable best practice, or do we choose the shorter supply chain? And I know there's no easy answer for that. So would you just be able to talk a little bit about the seafood labeling, where you were going, and then also what we're working on in the Australian seafood labeling area.
Yeah, so that is where you can have that. The people need to know, and you need to know as well from your suppliers. It's not just the end consumer that needs to know. Your suppliers also should be able to tell you what is it, where is it from, and how is it caught. And something important to note is that just because it says product of somewhere, that doesn't actually mean that's exactly where it was caught or farmed. It obscures everything prior to that. It's purely the last place of modification. So something may be product of Thailand, but there we go. But it may have been caught in Australia, it may have been caught in South America, and then shipped around the world, just repacked in Thailand before it comes to Australia. So it is really, really crucial. Unless it says caught, origin of, or caught in, or farmed in a certain place, then that is an unknown. With restaurants, have that level of detail as well. Don't just say whether it's Australian, imported, or mixed. Have that full level of detail for people to be able to understand a little bit more. Sorry, I'm just going to have a sip of water.
And just so that goes back to Robin's comment in the chat box or question. One of the things that I've always found as a chef, when it comes to education is not really just a PowerPoint or sharing some text. Our power as chefs is we educate through our food. We educate through our taste, and we can educate our consumer by cooking, and that's what we know. So by being really transparent on our menus, being really transparent in the story of our dish, it's a really incredible thing. So that just goes.
No, absolutely. And chefs and restaurants have such a big role in creating and driving demand, because people will look to chefs to get inspiration. And if they discover a fish on a menu or in a cookbook that they haven't been exposed to before, but they can get at the fishmonger, and it's been beautifully prepared, it tastes incredible, it smells incredible, they'd be dying to either use it again in their homes if they can get it at a fishmonger, but if they can't, it's something that they will order again if they see it. So chefs really can play a huge role in that space. Be transparent, advocate for better change, but also diversify demand. So you reduce pressure on the charismatic species that you're seeing so often, and use things that you might not see and people might not be familiar, but put it on your specials and have it there initially, and create something incredible with it, as we know you all can. And, people will start wanting it more.
Now, when we talk about chefs and we start to talk about how do we plan a menu, right? How do we plan a menu around seafood? What are some of the considerations? We want to have a sustainable seafood menu. Yes, we have the GoodFish Guide, 100%. What other factors? I know seasonality comes into it, climate weather. Can you chat with us about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So seasonality plays a big role, because not all seafood is going to be available all the time. They may naturally migrate, but it also could happen that in some states there might be a fishing closure at a certain time of the year because the fish are spawning. And the reason they do that is because many fish species aggregate or get together to spawn, which makes them an incredibly easy target if you wanted to go catch them. So they'll close the fishing in that state, in that time when that's happening. So it's really useful to be flexible about what you're going to put on your menu. Use what's around, use what's in season, and in some instances things are in abundance. They're in a peak of when they're going to be around. So that can help with access to a supply, increased supply, really great quality because it'll be super, super fresh. And it can also help with pricing. If there's an increase in supply, theoretically the demand. If there's an increase in supply, the price should go down. So some useful tools about this. We're busy upgrading our website to include some of this information on seasonality of key species, but we haven't finished that yet. So in the meantime, there are some really great resources out there if you want to find out what is in season. The Sydney fish market's pretty useful. It gives a really good breakdown of, key family species, and it'll say when things are in season in a nice, simple manner. But if you are looking to delve a little bit deeper, and there is this seasonality calendar, which I've got at the bottom of this slide, and it is quite old. It's about 15 years old, but it is still relevant, and it breaks down key species found in Australia by month, by state. So, if you've got something specific in mind and you want to see when it's available, this can be quite useful as well. in terms of,
let's talk, let's talk about weather. How does climate impact?
So fish stocks aren't just impacted by fisheries. Obviously, that is a really big driver, but the climate plays a huge role as well. So climate-driven changes like warming ocean temperatures and acidification, they have a big role in changing where the fish will actually be found and how plentiful, in what numbers they're going to be found. So Australia's oceans and commercial fisheries are already being impacted by climate change. Waters off the southeast and southwest coast of Australia are already known as, in particular, global warming hotspots. And then our tropical ocean is also warming faster than other oceans around the world. So that's quite something. There was a study, and over 100 Australian marine species, have started migrating south to escape the heat. And other extreme events have also harmed things like Australia's seagrass, kelp forests, mangroves, and coral reefs. And those form critical habitats and nurseries for many species of marine life. So they're really, really important. And so while some of these species are moving south, some can't, and that can lead to clashes where species come across each other for the first time and they haven't engaged before. Now, this is quite an interesting one. Species like sea urchins thrive in a warming ocean, and they can overgraze kelp forests. So you've got a beautiful picture of a kelp forest on your left. And kelp forests play such an important role for abalone, rock lobster, and many other fish species. And overgrazing from these urchins changes these systems into unproductive sea urchin barrens that pretty much don't have any seaweed and are very difficult to recover. So the picture on the right is now this sea urchin barren. So it would have looked something like the picture on the left at some stage. And that's as a result of the warming oceans. It's as a result of the fact that sea urchins can be quite an invasive species. So urchins are actually great options in terms of diversifying demand, because it's something different, but it also helps the environment by reducing their numbers and their impact. So it's one of those weird ones that we say, go, eat more of, which we wouldn't normally do. We would say everything in moderation, but this one, go for it.
Absolutely. Underutilized seafood, seasonality of seafood, the climate impacts. And then not only that, but also the practices that our either aquaculture or fisheries are using are incredibly important to be considering as we're planning a menu. We keep going back to, as a community, we have this power to create this sustainable change or sustainable shift in the way we're operating, and to be able to cook and create that, but with our skill is just an incredible, it's a great experience. Now, of course, we're at this point of the day. Is there any questions or anything else we would like to chat on? Okay, Robin, again in the chat box, are you aware of other countries who have developed guidelines like GoodFish, and what kind of stakeholders are involved in the creation of this resource? That's a pretty good question.
Oh, that is a very good question.
Robin.
The GoodFish Guide is what's available on the Australian market, but it's not necessarily going to be applicable in the US, in South Africa, in the UK. So we've got Monterey Bay's Seafood Watch in Australia, in America, in the USA. They've got a really extensive, comprehensive list of species from all over the world. There's a South African version of GoodFish, which also uses a traffic light system. There's the UK's Marine Conservation Society, not to be confused with the Australian Marine Conservation Society, but they've also got a good, they've actually also got a GoodFish guide, and it just, these are all independent. So this is really, really important, is that, you know, these aren't certification bodies. These aren't certification tools. They are independent of government and of industry. So they are all NGOs that are just providing an objective view of what is happening in the oceans in aquaculture operations. What was the second part? I think did I answer the second part? Yeah, I think I answered the second part of it.
Absolutely.
And I can see we've got,
Absolutely.
I can see here we've got MSC. We do have MSC here in Australia as well, the Marine Stewardess Council, which
Yes.
we've got access to a lot of their resources too,
Yeah,
which we'll be putting up on the website also.
So I'd just like to speak to that. You know, third-party certifications like the MSC definitely have their uses in terms of traceability. You know, they have this thing called chain of custody certification, which will mark every point in the supply chain, making sure that what they say is in the box is actually in the box. So from a traceability point of view, it's great. The challenge that we have with certification bodies, and it's not just the MSC, there are a whole bunch of other ones, is that, you know, they used to have a really high standard, and we just haven't felt like that standard has been consistently upheld. So I would just suggest, and they're not just a blanket rating of green on our guide. We do have MSC certified fisheries on our green, amber, and red list. Yeah, so just because there are different levels of environmental sustainability being applied to these certifications. So one thing to also note about these certifications is they are paid for by industry. So it's very hard for them to be fully independent and provide a fully independent and objective view of what is going on. So that's where GoodFish, being independent of government and industry, we can provide that objective view. We don't take money from industry. We don't take money from government. So just you know, still use the guide. If it'll have great information on the box, fantastic. But then just use the guide to determine its environmental sustainability.
To be able to support that, you know. And I think the other day as well, we were discussing some improvements or projects that are underway in the labeling area. Could you just briefly talk to that?
Yeah. Yes,
that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, so, you know, labeling definitely needs to become more transparent. And so the Australian Marine Conservation Society, AMCS, who GoodFish is an initiative of, we've got a petition out there at the moment, which is trying to get more transparent seafood labeling legislated by government, because that's the problem. It's not legislated. It's not mandatory to have this detailed information on board. So we've got we can share a link to this petition if you'd like to sign on to it. It is really, really important. The reason it's so important is better labeling legislation, and better labeling reduces your risk as chefs to mislabeling. You know, you're not the end user, but you provide it to the end user. So it reduces your risk by creating a more transparent supply chain. Your suppliers will have to have this information available to you, and you'll know that it will be right as well. Half the issue with it not being legislated is that there's a large amount of mislabeling happening in Australia. So there was a study done, and it found 1 in 10 seafood products were mislabeled, but in restaurants it was almost double that. It was almost almost 1 in every 5 seafood products were mislabeled. And when we're talking about a species like flake, it's 90% of species were mislabeled. So that's 9 out of every 10. So, you know, we need better legislation to ensure that isn't happening. More transparent labeling, more transparent supply chain.
So just before we move to our closing, there is one more question in the chat box from Wayne. He's got a question about tuna. He noticed that it's the better choice green light list doesn't include tuna. Is there a reason we should be eating less tuna, and is it on your amber list?
So, okay, so tuna is one of those ones that we've got on our amber and our red lists, and that's because you get different types of tuna. You get different fisheries that catch it, and it's caught in different areas as well. So I would like to just say being on the amber list isn't a bad thing. It's just not the best. So amber list, we still support people buying, the chef partners, we still support them buying stuff on our amber list. It just means that there's something to be aware of, maybe something we need to keep watch on. And so depends on what species it is. I think I'm not actually even going to guess, but we've got yellowfin, we've got bluefin, we've got albacore in Australia, and they're all on different lists. So if you just add a bit more detail, I would like to say if we're talking canned tuna, which maybe we're not in the restaurant setting, but we've been working really hard to develop a guide or a recommendation on that. So it won't be the same as our assessments that we've got on the website, but it'll at least be an indicator of those brands that are doing better than others. So that's from a canned tuna perspective.
Wayne's definitely only using fresh tuna.
Yeah, I know.
He's straight there.
I thought I'd add it in just as an in case, but I was pretty certain it wasn't required in this setting.
So as we start to move to closing this session, which has been incredible, we all have this power to not only, like you touched on before, advocate not only for a sustainable seafood industry, but sustainable agriculture, sustainable farming. We have the power to be able to not only influence our consumer, but like you're saying before, Steph, influencing the best practice of our supplier and make sure that we have transparency on the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. Absolutely. So by choosing sustainable seafood, you're supporting fishers and aquaculture industries that are trying to do good, that are not having a detrimental impact on the environment. So, it's really, really important. And as chefs, you not just in your kitchen and in your restaurant, you're seen as a credible voice. So whether it's on social media, whether your consumers really will look to you, your suppliers will appreciate your input, and other chefs around you that engage with it. You really can create quite a remarkable shift in the market.
And I can see one of your colleagues has put in some comments, Peta, I think it is. I probably pronounced that wrong. I apologize straight away. Saying that Eastern Australian tuna and Eastern Commonwealth yellow tuna are both amber listed. And if you want more details, that you have a blurb on your for the reason for this and the reason for the listing on your website. So I'd highly encourage everybody to hop on and have a look at it, because that's really valuable information to have. Yeah, and I know myself being Irish, I know the change in our seafood from 20 years ago to 10 years ago to now. 10 years ago, everything was overfished. There was fish trawling going on coming into the Irish Sea. It was lovely when I was home at Christmas to see that variety of seafood has come back in, because there is a real push from the Irish chefs, from the industry, and from that side of the world for more sustainable practices and to think about what you're putting on a menu.
Yeah, that's incredible to hear. That's really positive.
Yeah.
And going back to something I mentioned earlier, around sustainable procurement, it can seem really overwhelming when we're starting this, especially if we've got 35 items on a menu and really where do we start? I think we always approach at the Table Food Consultants is choose your top 2 most consumed items. Don't overcomplicate it. Use the resources that are available to you. Look for transparency on the supply chain and create your switch, whether that's switching for best practice or switching for a smaller more local supply chain. And by creating that step in the first two, and then just using that as a flow-on effect, and a lot of the time that can be seafood. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us today and for talking to us about an amazing resource that I know we can all use throughout our jobs.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
There's one final question that's popped in. Typical me, I always have a question, but this is from Wayne. Are there any promotion points or labels we can use on our menus from GoodFish? Is there anything available in that space at the moment?
That's a good question.
No, it is a great question, and it's one that it's one we've had a few times before. So because we're not a certification tool or a certification body, we don't do that. There's the risk that we just don't have the process or the process in place to be able to make sure that while you may be doing the right thing, someone else might not be, and then that's the risk of greenwashing, essentially, unfortunately. But we do have, we've got the GoodFish project, which is our market side of the work, and we work with chefs, we work with businesses, seafood businesses across the country, and we become partners with them, and essentially they make a commitment to not sell red listed seafood, and that's a transition as well. It's not an immediate thing, it's a transition. We work with them to help them get there, and then they have access to our logo that they can use, but it's not necessarily a stamp next to an item, like next to a seafood species. It'll be, we're working with GoodFish to not sell red listed seafood, and links to the guide and stuff. So just because we're not a third party certification tool, we just don't we don't have those systems in place, unfortunately.
And I notice your colleague has come back in saying that on your website you keep a list of your partner restaurants and that you promote them on social media. So it's a really good linkage in there to get it out there with what you're doing.
Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone's keen, feel free to reach out to me. We're more than happy to advise on procurement. That's what we're trying to do, is shift the market, and we obviously need restaurants to be able to do that. So we're more than happy to grow our community in that way.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a valuable resource for anybody that's on here is not aware. I must admit, I use this website a lot especially within my teaching, or when I'm menu writing, or when we're going overseas. So yes, it is valuable. And as you can see, there's the petition you were speaking about that will also be up. We'll make sure these resources go up on the website afterwards today on ours as well. So Stephanie, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time. I hope your voice is okay. I know what it's like presenting when you're going, oh my gosh, there's people here and you're put in the spot, but we really appreciate it.
Thanks for giving me the time.
Natalie.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It was really great just to be able to understand the resources and look at more solutions rather than looking always at the challenges. Start looking at the solutions and the resources we have. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Don't forget, next Monday, we have got another webinar series, which is food waste, controlling the value of your bin. We will be looking at all the different ways to be tackling your food waste, and we can't wait to see you then. Thank you so much for having me, Karen. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank
you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.